Content warning. This story depicts slavery, corporal punishment, poisoning, and public execution. It treats those subjects with restraint and gravity. Spring came to the Vale do Paraíba in a white rain. The hills smelled of coffee blossom and wet earth, and the estate awoke as if polishing itself in time for a portrait. Carriages returned along the long red dust road. Silver was rubbed until it caught the daylight in a dozen small suns. The parlour's curtains were starched into exact folds. At the centre of the house, as if the rooms themselves had been taught to expect her, sat a library whose shelves knew more of the world than the Valley ever had. Joaquim moved through that house with the quiet authority of someone who had been given certain intimacies and refused others. He had been taught to read by the Baron's grandfather, an indulgence that was less charity than habit, a trick of propriety preserved by an old man who liked to see words bend and make sense beneath his spyglass. Words had become a private estate for Joachim, one in which he kept his small treasures. A battered French volume of Victor Hugo, a scrap of translated verse, the names of distant cities that tasted faintly of smoke and salt. The house called him by other names. He answered them all and did not make them his own. Isabel de Almeida returned like a scent arriving ahead of a woman. City dresses trailed behind her on the stairs. Her laughter, when she laughed, was quick to rise and leave no residue. She had been away long enough to carry the conviction of novelty. Where the household expected a dutiful daughter, they received someone who read foreign papers and listened to forbidden songs, who watched the world as though considering its angles. She stepped from her carriage as the coffee trees shed their blossom, and everything within the household straightened, as if any slack would be noticed and punished. They saw each other first in fragments, a hand polishing a tray, a shadow dismissed at the edge of an embroidered curtain. Their real meeting came one humid evening when the household had retreated to concerts and card games, and the library had been left, improbably, unlocked. It was not a theft of time so much as a finding. Isabel had wandered among the books as if rediscovering an old companion. Joachim had been already there, behind a lamp, the French title open between his palms. She did not startle him. The lamplight laid thin maps across the page, and in that light two people could be two kinds of strangers. When she asked what he was reading, the oddity of her question, soft, precise, without a tremor of superiority, unsettled more than any accusation might have. He answered in the language that had no right to be his in that room, and her delight at the sound of words foreign to the valley was as ungoverned as a child's. Their conversation began as it had to, about the lines on the page, about the grand, urgent melancholy that Hugo wrote with, about exile and the stubbornness of hope. It moved quickly, the way a current finds a new channel, into quieter things. What a city smelled like when it rained, whether a lover could be a refuge or a chain, whether laws could be moved by a single, determined hand. Isabel listened as if cataloguing possibilities, rather than deciding them. And Joachim, accustomed to reading faces in the half-light of the servitude quarters, found in her an unexpected equality, someone who treated his sentences as if they contained the right to belong. They met again, and then again. Nights became the theatre of their intimacy, books between them, a shared lamp whose flame did not ask questions. He brought translations of poems, and she brought small, wrapped volumes smuggled from town. They spoke of freedom as if it were a house that could be crossed room by room, rather than an enormous fence that circled the horizon. On a night softened by the scent of jasmine, when the moon slid like a coin across the garden pond, she put a hand on his arm and said, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that when she inherited the estate, she would grant him his papers and his name. It was an improbable thing, pronounced in a country built on the opposite business, and yet the way she pronounced it made his heart believe the entire world might rearrange itself. His answer was not a promise he could give. It was a hand pressed to hers, a vow not to leave her side. They kissed then the first time, and it felt less like a theft than a rehearsal of rites. For a few small months, the house reoriented itself to their secret axis. They discovered one another in the margin of an empire, the places where learned words met unlearned freedoms, the way shared laughter could be an act of rebellion precisely because it refused to be concealed. If the house was a stage, the rest of the valley was the audience. Whispers spread, some born of envy, some of malice. José, a man who had once been near to Joaquim in age and circumstance, eyed their closeness with a mix of resentment and hungry calculation. Where love had made Joaquim a different man, it made José watchful and small. He began to pry, not with the bluntness of overseers, but with a sharpness that found purchase in the brown light of gossip. A half-word in the kitchen, a frown misplaced in the yard, the idea that perhaps some among them sought ill-gotten advantage. Rumor is a simple blade. It divides fabric where hands are already tired. Other pressures came from rooms where the music did not soften. Baron Rodrigo de Almeida was a man for whom property contained moral truths. The house had been his province for decades, and his daughter's marriage would be the measure of the estate's future. Captain Antonio Ferreira, a man whose uniform made him a useful son-in-law, began to appear with a punctuality that suggested calculation more than courtship. The captain's visits were accompanied by men who spoke quietly of commerce and titles, and the baron smiled as if sealing a ledger. Isabel felt the net tighten. She moved between the library and the veranda with the distracted energy of someone standing beneath a roof that might collapse if she hesitated. In private, she tried to argue with the very notion of the inheritance she had promised. What would it mean to act against family? What would it mean for those who depended on the estate to lose its stability? She rehearsed these anxieties aloud to Joaquim, and he answered as best he could, with the patient logic of someone who had learned to measure hope in small increments. Maria watched them both with a different attention. She was a woman of the kitchen, who knew dosages and draughts by the feel of a root between her fingers, who had kept more children fed and more secrets warm than anyone would ever write upon a ledger. Where some of the household saw Isabel's interference as romantic foolishness, Maria saw the risk with an immediacy that did not permit abstractions. She had been present when children were born on the floor, when a fever turned a house into a corridor of whispers. To Maria, promises were not worth the price if they threatened to sharpen the overseer's cruelty upon those who dared to love across the dividing line. Their nights grew private and urgent. Joaquim's reading taught him more than syntax. He began to look at plants with the long curiosity of someone learning a new language, names on the margins of an herbarium, notes passed in the dark about bitter leaves and the small sleeping powers of seeds. He learned that a house is not only a collection of rooms, but also of remedies and poisons, and the places where they could be found. His learning was not malicious by design. It was a necessary industry, a way of making certain he could answer questions the world might raise. The happiness of those months resembled a vessel pressed into the wrong hand, beautiful, fragile, and misfit. There were mornings when Isabel's hair smelled of city smoke and sugar, afternoons when Joaquim could recite French verse, and she would correct his accent, evenings when the house felt smaller because they had found a space to hold their laughter. Yet each delight was bordered by the knowledge of a looming decision. The promise made in moonlight had not altered the ledger in any official room. The baron's will, the lawyer's files, the murmurs in the drawing-room, and then the household prepared for the sarau. A sarau was an exercise in visibility. The parlor was dressed in finery, musicians were hired from the nearest town, and the baron entertained men whose estates were measured against his own. The servants were arranged with precise choreography. Shutters opened at the right moment, the silver came forth, and the house became a public demonstration of order. It was in such a spectacle that private rebellions are either extinguished or compelled into the light. The evening the baron chose to announce his daughter's engagement, the air was heavy with the sweetness of punch and the glitter of candlelight. Isabel moved among the guests with a poise that betrayed an interior trembling. Captain Antonio stood by her side like a pledge the baron could hold up to the world. They played music, and the musicians struck familiar airs with the steady professionalism of people who had been paid to make pain beautiful. Joaquim had thought, perhaps foolishly, that his invisibility would grant him a place at the edges, a server with a tray, present but not seen. He stood where his station required, a dark suit of responsibility, hands steady beneath a silver salver. Yet submission does not guarantee protection. It can be the perfect camouflage for humiliation. Someone in the crowd laughed and then stopped, and in that silence Joaquim felt the house tilt. When the baron rose, the conversation dropped like a blanket. He spoke easily of alliance and legacy and propriety. the language of men who measure human futures in contracts. He praised Captain Antonio's family, counted the benefits to the estate, and with a gesture that included the assembled guests like a seal, announced the engagement. There was applause by obligation. Guests raised their glasses, and music resumed as if to patch a torn garment. Isabel's face went pale with more than disappointment. She held herself with the grace of someone who had rehearsed pain into politeness. Her eyes traveled the room and found the lamplight in the library window, where Joaquim had stood, and for a second an impossible pleading flickered there. It was never a public duel between them. It was a small, private betrayal, corroded into an irrevocable thing. After the proclamation, the house adjusted its air to include the lie. Conversations were reskinned. Servants moved with an evenness that was an effort of will. But cruelty does not need ceremony to flourish. José, who had watched the couple with the narrowness of a man whose grievances require an object to hold them, began to circulate hints and half-statements. That the books had been shared, that words had been exchanged after dusk, that a daughter had promised the impossible. Rumors in the Cenzala found purchase not because they were true, but because they were useful. People who had been taught to be small learned quickly to use smallness as a weapon. Sebastião, the overseer, saw in rumor justification. He was a man accustomed to enforcing the house's order, and his brutality had been overlooked because it maintained the estate's economy. Where whispers could be dismissed as childish, physical punishment could be displayed as deterrent. He increased surveillance. He watched the library, the back stair, even the servants' washyard with a menace that smelled of discipline. His cruelty was not sudden. It had been patient and accumulative, an architecture of fear rather than sudden catastrophe. When the house's private unfairness became, in effect, a public problem, the Baron ordered measures. The manner of punishment chosen was an old instrument of authority, the whip, intended to correct and to humiliate publicly. Joaquim had expected indignities. He had imagined slights and the slow, clever injuries of people with power. He had not imagined how a single afternoon could alter a life. They took him to the yard at noon, when the sun would be a witness and shadows would be short. People gathered not because they wished to observe, but because the household had been arranged so that nothing could be done privately without the knowledge of everyone. The overseer held a choir whip in his hand like a scepter. The Baron watched from a door, as if watching were part of the penalty. No face looked at Joachim. All eyes found the ritual. Maria, whose hands had washed the Baron's linen and stitched the baby's first jacket, stood at the back, her jaw set and her palms clenched into the small human fists of someone who could not stop what was to be done. Isabel looked away. In the moment before the first stroke, the world narrowed to a single sense, sound. The whip cracked not like a sudden revelation, but like a mechanical truth. Each lash spoke of rules, of learned responses, of the weight placed upon bodies that had no place in law. The description of what happened thereafter is not a catalogue of gore, but a register of intention. The lashes came as a sentence, measured and exacting, meant to produce obedience and spectacle. Joachim drew breath and let the world fold around him. He felt humiliation as a cold, efficient thing. It entered the quiet muscles of his back, and with each motion he catalogued who had the power to make the body speak. He noted the faces in the crowd, the barons, the captains, the guests who had applauded the engagement, because it mattered more than the physical pain. They were witnesses, and witnesses have the power to bury as efficiently as they have the power to exonerate. 1 stroke, 2, 3, until the ritual was complete. The overseer stopped because the law of the house had been satisfied, and the ritual had been performed. The Baron nodded as if concluding a matter of business. Joachim was left on the grass with the motion of his breath returning, as if a thing had been taken from him. He tasted iron on it, not from blood shown to the crowd, but from something older, the metallic knowledge that his body was a ledger upon which debts could be recorded. In the days that followed, the house kept moving as though nothing irreversible had occurred. The sarau had been praised in polite conversations. The engagement was discussed as if it were a natural consequence. The silver was set upon tables for dinner. Yet corridors held a new, quieter terror. Joachim did not speak of the whipping. He folded the memory inside him and let it become a map. He walked through rooms with the awareness of one who has seen the underside of things and found that the seam had been cut. Isabel felt the cost in a way that was less visible but no less profound. She had announced to herself that the promise, once spoken, would be a light she could carry back into the life of her family. Instead, the promise had become a mirror, reflecting choices she did not wish to make. She moved among the house's people with an increasing pallor, as if her senses had been made acute to the variations of wrongness around her. There were nights she tried to read by candlelight alone, forgetting the books had once been the bridge between their souls. Other nights she would stand at the window and watch the Shenzala's small fires flicker, and feel smaller each time she could not turn her hands outward. Maria came to Joaquim in the dark, bringing a cup of thick coffee and a thin piece of bread, and stood a respectful step away. She did not offer platitudes. She had seen enough to believe that words did not always mend what's broken. Action did, or the possibility of action. "You will not yield to anger," she said in that calm tone that carried the weight of long experience. "It will make you grave, and the house is good at carving graves like they are craftwork." Joaquim listened. He had learned from books the art of irony and the temper of revolution, but nothing in ink could prepare someone for the particular geometry of a whip across the sun. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held a lamp, that had turned pages, that had polished silver until the household's reflection returned at him. The hands shook not with pain so much as with the comprehension that love had been answered by spectacle. There was a moment, then, when two forces suggested themselves to him with equal gravity. One was the quiet, long patience that had kept him alive, a life of small refusals, of collecting knowledge and friendships, of surviving another day. The other was new, a cold thing that started as an idea, a calculation. If the house measured power by public display, then public acts could be used to rewrite perception. The thought was dangerous and terrible and exacting. It settled in him like a seed set in a dark place, and began as any seed will to demand water and sunlight. He did not speak of such things with Maria. There was a look between them that contained both empathy and warning. She could not condone the flip of hurt into harm. She emphasized instead something more quiet, the memory of names, of dates, of small mercies, and the promise that someone must tell the story when all else failed. "Do not let your hurt make you a mirror of those who hurt you," she said. "Your life does not have to be their echo." Joaquim nodded, but gestures within a household are lonelier than words. The Baron's house had created the conditions that birthed his pain. It had also given him an education and an awareness that could not be easily undone. Isabel moved among them like a woman on a stern cliff. She owned remorse in a private manner, and made no apology that would alter the course of the Baron's decisions. Her silence when those lashes fell became a wound on him as significant as any strike. The days after the whipping were less dramatic than one expects in tragedy. Life resumed with a grotesque efficiency. The captain came more frequently. The Baron was pleased with progress. The house's ledger remained balanced. Yet reputations had been shifted. Joaquim's quiet presence acquired a rumor of danger, as if pain were an ingredient that altered one's character into something harder to predict. At night, Joaquim sat by the window with his book on a table and the lamp at his elbow. He traced inked phrases with a reverence tempered now by a new, precise cruelty. He began to catalogue not only poetry, but also lists, the names of plants Maria mentioned, the ways in which certain roots could blunt a fever or quicken sleep. He did not share those lists. He kept them like notes on a map no one else could read. Isabel drew away from the world that had promised her privilege and found herself unmoored. She visited the chapel alone and left coins on the altar more often than she shared words with anyone else. Once, in the privacy of the garden, she placed her palms on the bark of an espiradera and felt a prick as if the plant itself understood guilt. She began to tend a small bed of strange, glossy leaves, an activity she argued with herself about every time she knelt to pull a weed. Tending seemed an act of contrition, an attempt to nurture something gentler than the relationship she had strained. But tending alone cannot remove public consequence. Rumor continued its patient work. José became bolder. He did not need to produce evidence, he needed only to have the Baron's ear. Whispered phrases reached the captain, who paraded a confidence that registered as victory in the drawing room. The household, which had once been a space where secrets could be cultivated, had become a stage for power to enforce itself. The day came when Joaquim's name was spoken in a different tone, as if someone were rehearsing the steps of a dance that would end poorly. He felt the movement of suspicion like a draft under a door, insistent, making the house colder. So he prepared not with weapons, but with the persistence of someone who had always gathered information. He listened, he catalogued, he watched the way hands moved in the pantry, the way spices were stored, the small practices of the household that could be understood only by someone who had been thoroughly inside its mechanics. He found Maria in the kitchen one evening, her face lit by a single lamp, and he watched the sure arc of her hands as she kneaded dough. "They do not see," she said, almost to herself, as if to confirm the obvious. "They think themselves invincible, because they forget what keeps their tables full." He nodded. He had memories now that did not belong solely to him, 100 small instructions on how to measure a life by consumption and care. He began to map the house in his mind as if it were a book that could be rephrased, a ledger that could be corrected. The air shifted months later when a letter arrived from the city, a formal announcement he had long feared. Captain Antonio's family had made the match official. Wedding preparations would begin. The Baron's satisfaction was a visible thing, an expression of a man who knew his world had been ordered back into its proper channels. For Joaquim and for Isabel, the announcement did not close any door. Rather, it flung them open to a corridor lined with mirrors. She came to the library the evening before the captain's arrival, her cheeks hollow, her hands empty as if she had forgotten how to hold anything. The moonlight slatted across the page of the book he was reading, and for a moment they regarded each other like strangers who had once been intimate. He could have demanded that she keep a promise. He could have accused her of cowardice. Instead, he read a different text in her face, the tautness of a wire about to snap. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally, not with a shout but as a quiet inventory. Her breath hitched. "You made me see," she said, "the possibility of different things. But I am a daughter, Joaquim. I am a daughter of a father who believes a house is an organism. I did not know how to be other than he wanted me to be." He listened, and the world in that sentence collapsed into two shapes, duty and fear. He tried to measure which had been larger in her heart. He remembered the moonlit promise and the way her voice had been steady. He could think of all the justifications the world offered, the legalities yet to be written. He could count the ways the house had been built. The house answered in a language that promised neither parole nor mercy. She left him with a piece of paper pressed into his hand, a note, a last small shame and a reminder. It read, in a French that had the impatience of someone trying not to cry, that she had loved him, that she had promised, that she had failed. The paper was the kind of thing that makes small wounds become evidence. For Joaquim it was both a relic and a rebuke. Within a week the captain arrived, and the household swelled with the mechanical choreography of a union that bound estates as easily as ropes bind boxes. Music again, speeches rehearsed to the point they meant nothing, the sound of knives on plates masking the sound of a life dissolving into precedent. When the official day for the marriage was set, Joaquim felt himself condensed into a smaller and more bitter thing. He saw in Isabel's face at a distance the shape of someone privatizing their sorrow in a way that preserved social reputation while losing everything else. When the news circulated, when guests toasted and drank to the prosperity of an alliance, someone in the kitchen let fall an exclamation, "They have chosen a captain over a man." The phrase lived in the servants' quarters like a cough that refuses to leave. José's smile widened into a predatory pleasure. Sebastian's eyes hardened. The house, which had once contained a possible future for a man who loved, now made that future unthinkable. It is an old sorrow that rage arrives not as thunder, but as a steady, insidious heat. After the humiliation and the public ritual of the law, after the music and the laughter that made the whip seem sanctioned, Joaquim returned to his chamber and sat with the book on his knee. He read Hugo's lines about justice and exile, and he found in them a reverberation that made his chest heavy. The words that had once comforted him now opened fissures. He read of wrongs that did not fit the law, of the possibility of bearing witness. When the overseer came the next morning with new orders, more labor for a household that claimed not to have spare muscle, Joaquim performed them as if each motion were a syllable in a language he now intended to speak. He moved with the profession of someone who had learned both servitude and the virtues of observation. He catalogued the places where the house stored its secrets: a certain jar of bitter almond oil in the pantry, a set of plants in the back garden Isabel tended for reasons he could not fully know, a series of notes Maria had left in the margin of recipe books. Knowledge is often the slowest weapon. It must be collected, refined, and concealed. There were nights he lay awake thinking of the way the whip had left his skin, not brand, but a ledger. He felt the history of the house in his marrow and the future metastasizing from one decision. In the quiet, he imagined acts of equal publicness and equal consequence, acts that would be a mirror held up to the people who had performed his humiliation. The thought of revenge was not a single image, but a calculus forming like frost on a window, thin, patient, and dangerous. When Maria visited him that night, her face was a map of patience and worry. She offered him a cup of coffee and sat opposite, her back straight as if holding in place a war. "You have learned much," she said, measuring him as one measures a pot. "Knowledge is dangerous for everyone, but most for those who have it and are in the wrong place. Do not let what they did to you make you what they are." He looked at her and felt both the temptation to act and the terrible responsibility for those who would be caught in the crossfire. If he moved, others would move with him. Innocence, Benedita, the children in the Cenzala, could be scarred by gestures intended solely to punish. It was a moral equation complicated by hunger and by blood. Yet even as he weighed his options, an inner change had occurred. The man who had read in the lamplight had felt hope become a thing that could be bargained for, and when that bargain failed, it left a vacancy where forgiveness might have gone. Joaquim found himself ready to learn further kinds of craft, botanical subtleties, the slow art of preparing things that the house used every day without question. He watched the kitchen's mortar and pestle as a place where knowledge could both heal and harm. It was not a decision made in a fit of vengeance, but a slow planting of intention, an intention as grave as the world that had given the lash. As the afternoon sun slanted low and the house drew long shadows, Joaquim stood at a window and watched Isabel speak with the captain on the veranda. She kept her composure. He watched the way she moved, and his memory pulled back to the night of promise. He felt the old tenderness, and beside it an ember of cold deliberateness. Love had been the first tutor, humiliation had become the second. The narrative of the household continued outward, polite and elegant, but within the margins the story had shifted to a darker register. Joaquim began, in secret and in small ways, to test the possibilities of knowledge. Not out of a thirst for spectacle, but as one who needed to know what a house took for granted. It was an innocent kind of espionage at first, identifying which plants were kept for flavor, which roots for fevers, the hours when medicine was prepared, and who handled the sugar. Knowledge, after all, had been granted to him once as a curiosity. Now it was being reclaimed as a tool. The parting between what he had been and what he might become happened not in a dramatic overthrow, but in the accumulation of small choices. A book read late at night, an herb identified in the daylight, a question posed to Maria and answered in a whisper. The day of the captain's arrival approached like a tide, and with it the inevitability of a life rerouted. Joaquim felt the house pressing against him like a shore. It reshaped him quietly, imperceptibly into someone with an intention at the center of his chest. When the house finally settled into the clatter and song of another festivity, Joaquim stood at his place and felt the crowd as if it were a net. He thought of the lash, of the Baron's nod, of Isabel's pale hand on the paper that admitted failure. The story had not reached the point of explosion, but the quiet arithmetic of his days had shifted. In the Cenzala, in the pantry, in the library's lamplight, seeds of a plan began to take root. Slow and patient as any bitter plant. He had not yet acted. He only prepared. The line between thought and deed remained visible and tremulous. Outside, the estate continued to shine. Inside, in the dark corners where servants kept their small lives, something new waited. A reckoning that would not be spoken of in polite company, and would not be measured in monetary ledgers. It would be measured in the tremor of promises broken, in the way public humiliation begets private calculation, and in the slow chemistry of grief turned to resolve. The house kept its habits. The coffee blossoms fell and made the grounds look as if they were covered in snow. Guests came and went. The Baron praised alliances. Isabel kept her hands busy with plants and paper, and at times wrote a line and then crumpled it. Joaquim kept his book and his lists in a drawer that held nothing else. Maria tended her fires and said aloud the names of those who had fetched water and who had died under fevers so that memory would not leave them. When dusk gathered and the lamps were brought out, the library closed its shutters against the night. 2 people sat alone within, one who had once promised freedom, the other who had been promised and betrayed, and between them an interval had opened that would not be closed by regret alone. The whip's echo lingered, not as a present pain but as a shaping absence. It had taught Joaquim the geometry of power, and with that knowledge came a dangerous faculty, the capacity to translate love's betrayal into a design for redress. He slept that night with his hand over his heart, feeling the slow beat of a body that contained a new and terrible gravity. Outside, the estate's lamps burned on, and the house rehearsed its outward respectability. Inside, the seeds had been sown. The answer to what he might do when the captain's voice grew used to the house's rooms would have to wait for another turning of the season. For now, the quiet was enough, a patient interval before a decision that would shape many lives. He let the house keep its lighted facades. He kept his watch in the shadow corners, where stairs met stone and herbs were stored in cracked earthenware. The seed of intent took root in the slow, patient way that only grief knows, not as a flash, but as a calendar of small acts. He learned how long alcohol hung in the air after a guest left a glass. He noticed which chamber pots were rinsed first, and by whom. He learned, with the quiet appetite of someone poring over a map, where the Baron's life touched the narrow resource of the servants' hours. He spoke rarely, and when he did it was to ask Maria, in the low voice they shared, about distinctions no one outside the kitchen would ever have cause to make, which leaf bitterened a broth, and which one relieved an ache, how a colour in a bruise told of a nature one might mistake for accident. Maria answered in measures and metaphors. She warned, and her warnings were soft like a hand on cloth. Knowledge could heal, and knowledge could be a slow, terrible instrument. Before the first act was committed, Joaquim performed a kind of apprenticeship in patience. He gathered notes, lines from his books that tasted of indignation, the small practical wisdom he extracted from Maria, the hours in which the house's elite left certain windows ajar, certain storerooms unlocked in the complacency of proprietors. He watched Sebastião the overseer with a scrutiny that proved itself an education. Sebastião had been brutal in ways that were methodical, not theatrical. A measured cruelty, organized into routines, an economy of fear. If violence is a craft, Sebastião had its instruction manual memorized. He had an eye for those moments that, if exploited, would produce an unremarked removal. The night the first death happened, rain had closed the distance between sky and earth, and left the estate smelling of wet coffee blossoms and turned loam. Joaquim had allowed himself a small human perversity. He felt, in the minutes before the deed, a reading of an old book as though approaching a passage he had long wanted to understand. He did not imagine himself monstrous. He imagined himself precise, an artisan applying a technique he had learned in secret and in necessity. He thought of the lash. He thought of the paper Isabel had pressed into his palm. He thought of the Baron's measured nod. He thought, beneath those, of a life that had once been summoned to beauty and then reduced to a spectacle. Sebastião was found in the early morning near the cane fields, a man unmoving and evidently dead, his face slack with the same hollow cruelty he'd inflicted on others. The story the household preferred, snake in the harvest rows, fit the land's old credos, and the Baron's preference for private misfortunes explained away. The official world made easy sense of such things. A snake bite was a thing the earth might claim, a fate that required no human accountability. In the Cenzala the rumour travelled differently and quickly. No one mourned much for the overseer, though some who had felt his lash allowed themselves small, if guilty, hopes that justice might be served by nature. Joaquim received the news with an odd absence of triumph. He folded the fact into a ledger of consequence and watched the Baron's face as if searching for an expression that might betray suspicion. There was an immediate hush in the house, an unsettled air like the quiet after lightning. The Baron ordered an inquiry because one ought to do so. Captain Antonio made an affected show of sorrow because causality demanded posture. The guests talked in corners as if a death were a new spice to be sampled. None of them looked toward the library where Joaquim had sat reading the night before. None of them looked into the hands that had carried their silver with unrelenting steadiness. That invisibility was part of the mechanism he now used. To be unseen in the place that contained all manner of knowledge was a kind of advantage. But violence begets shadows, and shadows have tendrils. The overseer's absence did not produce justice for those whom he had tormented. It produced other configurations of fear. Those who had once been cowed by Sebastião's baton now needed wages and schedules rebalanced. The Baron appointed a substitute, a man whose temper was less skilled but more suspicious. In the kitchens and the quarters there were murmurs, but also a practical severity. Someone had to account for the change, and tasks once apportioned by an overseer's personal whim now fell into a new watchful order. Joaquim felt with a weight that surprised him a new attention given to his person. Not from compassion, from the accidental arithmetic of coincidence. He began to notice the way José lingered where he had not lingered before. Small questions disguised as casual remarks, a tone that aimed to find purchase in a man's private ledger. José had always been a small force of resentments. Now he seemed a man scoring the exchange rates of goodwill and greed. Joaquim watched him and catalogued his habits. He felt the loneliness of someone enacting a plan in which many would be affected, possibly innocent, possibly doomed. Maria's face returned in the quiet. Do not let your hurt make you a mirror of those who hurt you. The admonition was a sharp instrument, and Joaquim carried it like a splinter under his skin. The next act he planned with a surgeon's caution rather than an arsonist's abandon. He moved slow and precise, a tincture here, a substitution there, adjustments to tinctures Maria used to soothe fevers. He mixed little things not to instruct, but to observe people's responses, to learn how an illness ran through a body and then through a household. He did not wish the death of innocence. He feared it, and so tried to direct consequences toward those who had the power to measure and decide in the house. Yet houses seldom behave like human intentions. They distribute impact in ways that do not respect human calculations. The banquet that followed was meant to celebrate a season's prosperity. Pickings achieved, a market secured, alliances tightened. The parlor was bright with candles, and the plateware reflected a cautious vanity. There were speeches and small toasts, faces that had been instructed by habit to look forward and not beneath the table. Joaquim worked among them, as always, bringing carafes and tending to the petty emergencies of a room filled with privilege. He watched the way certain hands lingered over sweets, the way old women insisted on particular vintages, the way Benedita, who had been in the kitchen since she was a girl, moved like a shadow behind the stove. The poison at the banquet was not theatrical. It did not paint the table like a grotesque brushstroke. It wore the disguise of something ordinary, a spice mismeasured, a cake cooled in the wrong shade, a tray of chocolates that had been inspected and handled by many. Those who fell ill did so in a way that at first suggested a common food-borne misfortune: nausea, pallor, a sudden fainting here, a tremor there. By the time panic circled the room, 2 guests had died. One an elderly matron, Donna Mariana, whose laugh had once been heard over the estate's small events, and another a visiting trader, whose family would remember the loss as part of its ledger. The household's authority needed a scapegoat. Benedita, who had been seen in the pantry hours earlier, was quickly singled out by the more eager authorities. Her station in the kitchen, her habit of humming while her hands worked, her lack of friends among the elite made her a convenient candidate. She was not the kind of woman anyone bothered to defend. She had no patrons among the gentry who would go to bat for her. The Baron, in his need to demonstrate control, allowed a public accusation to form. Sebastião's replacement, new, raw and hungry for approval, pointed to Benedita with a certainty that required no proof. The law of the house is such that the accused are often those who have the least capacity to contest an allegation. The punishment was swift and social. Benedita was dismissed from her duties, shunned by those who had once called her by name. The house required a demonstration that order could be restored and that those who broke it would be smitten. Maria stood at the corner of this event like a slow, sorrowful weather watcher. She knew the recipes of the kitchen. She could list the exact stages of the dessert that morning, and her competence rendered the accusation absurd. But power does not require its rationality to align with truth. Benedita's life was diminished quickly. Her children whispered in the cenzala and watched a woman they loved be turned into a frail persona non grata. The house had saved its face at the cost of an innocent's dignity. Joaquim watched Benedita's humiliation as if it were a mirror of his own earlier disgrace. The death of Donna Mariana weighed upon him with a complexity he had not predicted. He had wished to punish, to terrify, to expose hypocrisy, but he had not planned for the immediate human collateral damage of a life extinguished that could not be counted as a ledger's justice. A moral calculus has a cold center. In the periphery are warm bodies whose loss refuses arithmetic. He felt rage and then a corrosion of satisfaction, an acid that tasted of betrayal even as it burned. That night he sought out Maria as he had in the months before, and found her by the stove washing a pot. Her movements had the economy of a woman anchored to a practice that had outlived many of the household's fashions. "They will eat the story that makes them comfortable," she said, without looking up. But what of her children? Who will tell them that the world did not turn its face on them because they deserved it? "There was no desire to kill innocents," Joaquim said, "because the truth demanded it. I did not intend this." "Intent is a thin mercy," Maria said, finally meeting his eyes. "You have to carry the weight of what happens. Men do not ask for that. You must make room in your chest for the remembering of those who are lost." Her warning was a net he had not meant to be caught in, and he recognized in it the moral ledger that would never balance. He returned to his small chamber and read lines of law and lines of verse, as if each might provide him with a consolation he could wear. The house, in its polite way, muffled its own conscience with busy work and redecoration. The Baron missed Donna Mariana in the surface senses of an estate's social calendar. The captain offered helpful consolations and increased his attention to the day-to-day politics of the household. The attempted poison on Isabel was an act both bolder and more personal. Joaquim had always calculated that to reach the head of the house would mean to touch that which the household cradled most closely, the daughter whose marriage had preserved the ledger's convenient order. He had wanted a message to be carried into rooms of influence. He had not wanted the daughter herself to become a martyr, yet the choice to punish by terrifying the center of power required a cost he had ill-measured. The chocolate Isabel accepted one afternoon, an offering from a visiting friend, polished and wrapped, contained an ingredient that made her sick in a way that suggested an accidental malaise. She recovered quickly, with a physician's care and with the household's devoted attention, and everyone agreed with relief that she had only been indisposed. But the episode left her paler and more fragile, and in her private chamber she wept in a way she refused to allow public. Joaquim watched the recovery with a hollowed contentment. He had succeeded in making the powerful feel vulnerable. He had not intended to see Isabel's small form frail by the hearth, cradled by hands that had grown accustomed to the performative tasks of grief and penance. He felt then the perverse intimacy of a man whose aim had struck the person he once loved. The wind in that instant had no room for romance. It was a cold wind that carried the weight of his choosing. Rumor, however, is a living thing with its own appetite. It turns not only on evidence, but on the psychic climate of the place. José, who had watched Joaquim from a distance and counted his resentments into a ledger, had been moving. His grievance, rooted in envy, in a sense of missed opportunities, in that multiplication of small injuries, found recompense in the prospect of favor. He approached those who would reward betrayal. The captain, the baron, a clerk from the town who kept records with an eager impartiality. He offered the suggestion that Joaquim kept forbidden books, and that those books were not merely for the aesthetic pleasures of the mind, but for the planning of an insurgency. In the world of a house that measured danger by convenience, José's words were currency. Discovery happened not as it is often imagined, a dramatic unveiling in a public moment, but as a series of small catches in a net. A trunk lid opened by chance revealed a paper, a pantry shelf shifted. A maid found a margin note folded into a recipe book. Items that Joaquim had hidden meticulously, lists of herb names, small pressed leaves, a scrap of paper in Isabel's handwriting, were collected together like evidence in an inquisition. The Baron summoned a search, largely to show the house's concern and decisiveness, and hands that had never touched a book with his interest now turned pages with zeal. The items were not incriminating in a legal sense of a modern court, but in the theatre of a household that needed a defendant they would be sufficient. They arrested Joaquim in the early morning, an act presented as necessary for the estate's well-being. The Chenzala watched through curtained windows as men shackled a figure they'd polished and trimmed for years. Joaquim walked with a steady gait. There was no melodrama in his capture. There was only the heavy, inevitable motion of a story reaching the phase where it must be named. He did not resist. He had learned that resistance could be a document of spectacle, but that spectacle could be managed. He allowed them his hands, cold and contained, and felt in his palms the small power of someone who had taken the time to understand what would follow. The house prepared its trial as a public machinery, meant to reinforce order. It would not be a fair hearing, that was never the point. It would be a performance of the law and a demonstration for the district, a warning about transgressions, especially those that threatened the neatness of hierarchical life. The Baron gave his tacit assent to the spectacle, for to condemn was to reassure the neighbors and to re-establish the codes that brokered property and line. José's testimony was careful and self-justifying. He painted himself as a patriot of propriety, rather than as a man who had sold the truth for comfort. The captain spoke in measured tones about stability. The physician, Dr. Augusto, drew clinical lines that required moral judgments that were never his to make. In the crowd were those who had once applauded the engagement and now sought moral absolution through the punishment of a single body. Under the eyes of men who desired both justice and display, Joaquim was bound to a chair and exposed to questioning designed to find a confession. The methods used for such ends in that place were not the crude spectacles of a faraway war, but the small methodical cruelties practiced under a house's authority. They aimed not merely for truth, but for spectacle, a confession that would produce a narrative useful to the estate. Joaquim could have chosen silence. He chose confession as a different instrument. In his choice was a strategy, to make his words a testament rather than merely a record of transgression. He spoke slowly, not to absolve himself of the acts, but to unfold their context. He told publicly and with a deliberate voice of a life taught to read in a room that would never see him as anything but property. He told of the kiss under the lamplight and of the promise that became a paper and then a burden. He described the lash, the counting of strokes, the Baron's nod as if it were an accounting of rights and ownership. He recited what he knew not as a manual, but as history. The bitter leaves that had stood by the sick and the small domestic alchemies that had been used both to tend and to control. He did not attempt to sanctify his actions. He confessed to them, each measured deed, each miscalculation, each sorrowful misprision of innocence, and he sat beneath their gaze as a man who had chosen to make a private revenge the language of public indictment. His speech was not theatrical in the sense of seeking applause. It sought to transform the moment of his punishment into testimony. When he spoke of Benedita's children, of Maria's patient hands, of Isabel's paper, the crowd shifted in its comfort. He named names. He told of how routine violence becomes institutional habit. The Baron and those who sided with him tried the usual strategies, to reframe the confession as madness, to point out the lack of education in a moral sense, to argue that a man could not have the language of revolution without being under the influence of winds elsewhere. Joaquim offered logic in return, and when logic failed he deployed the kind of moral arithmetic that makes people uncomfortable, that the lash taught men to obey, that obedience required no consent, that obedience did not make a system righteous. The trial ended in the way such matters did, a verdict that satisfied the household and the district authorities. It was a sentence that the Baron believed to be a necessary closing of a disruptive interval, the gallows. The authorities wanted an example. The public wanted reassurance. The law, as enforced in that place, wanted a single body to contain what it deemed a contagion. They scheduled the execution for a morning where the sky was a hard, pale sheet, and the estate's square filled with a crowd that included curious neighbors, men who had investments to keep protected, and servants like Maria, who could not but attend. Maria did not come because she felt drawn to a spectacle. She came because memory is sometimes a duty, and because there are moments when one must stand beside the person whose life one has tended in some small way. She stood a little back, holding in her hand a scrap of paper Joaquim had given her earlier, a list of names and dates and the small facts that someone must remember. Before the noose took its place, Joaquim asked for a few minutes, permission that the authorities granted because they expected either a broken man or a final repentant display. He asked not for pity, he asked to make what remained of his breath serve witness. He spoke without theatrics. He addressed not only the crowd but history, and he folded into his words the literary rhythms of his private education. He refused to absolve himself of the moral weight of his actions. He acknowledged the lives that had been lost and named the small innocent victims, a cooking woman whose bread had been her devotion, an elderly guest who had loved gardens, children who would learn a mother's absence as an inherited fact. He said that his actions were born of injuries, not of a glory, that the lash and the lie had taken more from him than his freedom, that anger, however justified, had a cost beyond the spectacle of revenge. And then he did something that was at once simple and devastating. He asked that his story be kept, told, remembered not as the tale of a single man's fury, but as evidence of an institution that allowed such furies to exist. "Do not carry my death as proof of my guilt alone," he said, voice steady as a ledger. "Carry it as proof that laws and houses that make of men property make of men violence." He spoke Isabel's name gently and called her to account without malice. He invoked the paper she had once given him, which had been the first publicness of the private promise. He implored that someone, Maria, if she would, keep his words and the names, and he asked that those who benefited from property think on what their comfort cost others. The mechanics of the execution were practiced and brutish in their ordinariness. The noose did an ordinary job on an ordinary morning, and the crowd made the ordinary motion of looking away. Some applauded the restoration of order, some shuffled, ashamed of their own enjoyment. For others it was a moment that refused easy answer. Isabel watched from a window, her hands hidden, her face drawn into a small mask of grief that would not erase her responsibility. In her eyes was a confession no court could demand, that her promise, which had meant freedom to a man who trusted it, had been priced under the coin of her obedience. Joaquim's body left the stage in the way the house directed. His words did not. In the weeks after, the house was quieter, as houses become when a major event has rippled through their fabric. The Baron went about his routines with a pale civility and an absent note when he sat to his meals. Captain Antonio observed the calendar and the ledger, with a composure sharpened by a new public obligation to uphold order. The people in the Cenzala drew closer, remembering the man who had been one among them, and had then been made an image of caution and horror. Some kept the memory alive in whispers, others by the stubborn work of daily survival. Isabel married the captain in a public ceremony that had less of rejoicing than the necessary motions of passing seasons. She had become the woman who had once promised and then chosen the family's ledger. Now she married into the ledger's next chapter. In the private hours of her life, the weight of what she had refused to do and what refusal had cost pressed on her like a nightly damp. She tended the espiraderas in her garden as if their leaves might absorb some of the guilt that no human penance could erase. She made small acts of contrition that were neither public nor grand. She taught the local children to read in a tiny room that had once been used for storage, and she left coins for widows she would not name in public. Yet these acts were at times more a rubbing of the conscience than a mending of the rupture. She had not freed Joaquim when promise could have made more difference. Now, having taken no decisive step earlier, she offered gifts that the ledger accepted, but which could not undo the past. Maria carried the heaviest practical burden of memory. She kept in her apron a small packet of Joaquim's notes and a tiny pressed flower that had been found in his papers. She told the children in the Cenzala the story the way mothers tell of weather patterns and births, less as sermon than as a necessary knowledge of their own making. She reminded them of names and the small acts of courage that do not require trophies. She lived as a witness, and witnessing became her vocation. Years moved with the streaming patience of the land. News reached the estate of a national conversation that would eventually culminate in emancipation. Talk traveled slowly, but inevitably. The Baron grew older, his authority soundtracked by the slow slide of time rather than the sudden declamations of a man's will. Captain Antonio tended his roles with an addictive care for propriety. His face was a record of small victories and a private exhaustion. Isabel's penance took on domestic forms that would not satisfy anyone's appetite for drama. She divided some of her yearly yields to support those in the Cenzala. She funded a teacher for the local children. She complained in private to no one about the weight that had hollowed her. Jose, who had once traded in whispers, left the estate when the new powers in the town made such men restless. He took with him a small purse of favors and a complicity that would dog him in a conscience he never learned to consider. He was remembered not for any heroism but for the neatness of his betrayal. Decades passed. The world altered its laws and its phrases. The estate saw seasons where the coffee trees were pruned and seasons where fewer hands answered the orchard's labor calls. The Cenzala, when it remained, still pulsed with human life. Births and deaths, small marriages, the ordinary catastrophes of hunger and health. The old code loosened as the law of the nation rephrased rights and obligations, though the echoes of inequality took many forms and did not vanish with any decree. It was in the spring of a later year, when Isabel was an older woman with hair that had taken to the silver of the moon, that she opened a long, locked chest. She had lived long enough to see the world change in ways that would have seemed impossible to the girl who once promised. The chest, which had been a repository of linens and letters and the small vanities of a life, contained among its folds the paper she had once given Joaquim. She had kept it, folded and reworn, as if the creases were a path back to some earlier courage. Her hand trembled as she took the pages, and she carried them not as relics but as instruments of a changed mind. She sought Maria then, who had settled into older age with a steady, unshowy dignity. They met in the garden where Isabel had once tended espiraderas. The sound of an old fountain filled the silence between their words. Isabel held out the chest as if returning a trust she had violated. She asked nothing of legal consequence. There were no laws that could bring back a man or undo the lives touched by him. She said, with a voice that had the humility learned by someone who has been taught by loss, that she wanted the land to be divided. She proposed, with a trembling earnestness, that plots be given to those who had labored as if their work had no accumulation. She promised, but promises had been the currency of her youth, to allot a portion of the estate's fields to those who had never been paid the worth of their labor. Maria received the papers with hands that had long mended both linen and less tangible fractures. She understood then that the division of land would be a complicated work, and that the old house would not surrender easily. She also understood that such gestures were not redemption. They would be a portion, a recognition, a small structural change that would ease some burdens. She accepted the chest and the papers and folded them into her care like a new sort of hearth. When the legal and social machinery of land division began its slow bureaucratic work, there were those who both applauded and derided the act. Some among the old class called Isabel's act belated and performative. Others, who had learned to survive on less, called it a significant alteration in the way resources were arranged. In the end, the division did not compensate for the absence of Joaquim, but it offered families a chance to make a living outside the house that had once owned them. Maria kept Joaquim's papers and the small pressed leaf in a box under her stool. She taught the children how to read some of the lines he had loved, and she told his story in the cadence of a woman who believes that names must be kept. She remembered, often with a sharpness that surprised those who knew her, that revenge, even when it arrives clothed in a certain logic, leaves a trail of grief. She taught the watchers of memory to name both the perpetrator and the victims, to avoid the comfort of declaring one a villain and the other entirely innocent. "We are all stitched into the cloth," she would tell the children. "Some of us pull at threads for good reasons, some for poor ones. Remember the pattern afterward." Isabel's acts of late penance did not erase her earlier failure. She grew old with a complex respect among those whose lives had been altered by the estate. She was often greeted with a cool civility by those who felt her measures were too small, and with deep gratitude by others whose children's livelihoods were altered. She never found a place in which she would be told her penance was complete. Instead, she became a figure of uneasy reconciliation, a woman who had once spoken a promise and then obeyed the weight of family rather than the call of that promise, who later tried to make amends in ways both structural and private. On an autumn evening, Maria brought out Joaquim's notes and read them aloud to a small circle, to a woman who had been Benedita's neighbor and who now had a small plot of land, to a young man who had been born in the final years of the house's old reign, and to a girl whose hands were raw from harvest. The notes were not a manifesto. They were the trembling drafts of a man who had loved, been loved, and then tried to translate pain into action. They were full of tenderness and of error, of literary allusions and the blunt arithmetic of a mind bent toward retribution. When Maria finished, there was a silence that was not applause, but the necessary state that follows a story told honestly, an awareness that human acts ripple outward in ways neither purely noble nor purely wicked. The land, when divided, did not become a utopia. The economic structures that had made the baron's wealth possible still shaped the region. Some households flourished, some did not. Memory lingered like a scent, of coffee blossom, of a lamplight's quiet, of the sound of a whip in noon sun. People who had once been servants became small proprietors. Others found the independence heavy with tasks it had not anticipated. The public penalty of execution remained a mark on the communal conscience, a flaw in the story those who had been comfortable told themselves. Isabel, in the final years of her life, walked sometimes to the spot where Joaquim once stood reading, and placed a small bouquet on a simple stone she had set there, not as atonement complete, but as an act that named a debt she could never pay. She invited Maria to decide how the division of land would be carried out, and she remained in those decisions as a figure of an unsettling, belated responsibility. When she died, a single line in a neighbor's letter recorded the fact with the same flatness with which most of history notes mortal ends. Those who loved her would say in later conversations that she had tried to do better, and those who judged her would say she had done too little, too late. Both statements hold truth in their smallness. Maria carried on. She became, in the tiny community that grew from the estate's unsettled earth, a keeper of stories and names. She taught the children to read Joaquim's verses and to remember the names of those whose lives had been curtailed in the name of order. She kept the small packet in a box and showed it to those who asked and to those who forgot. The story of Joaquim did not end at a rope. It continued in the daily lives of people whose labor had been so long misrecognized. The estate itself changed its face over the decades. Buildings decayed and were rebuilt in new layouts. Families moved away. New markets demanded different crops. Old power structures, though diminished, reinvented themselves. The coffee blossoms still fell in spring, with the familiar white scatter that had once announced a daughter's return. And sometimes children in the small fields would find the faded spine of a book in the underbrush and learn from it the strange pleasure of foreign words. Memory, like the soil, held layers, some sterile, some fertile. When people who had been children the day Joaquim was taken grew old themselves, they spoke of a man who had read in a lamp's hush and loved a woman who had been frightened by her father's demands. They spoke of Benedita, of Donna Mariana, of the lash and the list, and they could not settle their feelings into any simple moral righteousness. The tale had become, in the village, a parable of the cost of property and the incomplete measures of personal guilt. There was, in the end, no tidy resolution. That was the point the survivors understood most clearly. Revenge had been a response to injury, and it had remade lives in ways neither fully condemnable nor justifiable. Joaquim's acts had been both indictment and crime. Isabel's penance had been sincere and insufficient. The land each gained did not repair the quiet absences that remained. Yet the small acts, Isabel's late division of land, Maria's teaching, the children reading Joaquim's notes, created a modest alteration in the region's moral economy. They did not close the wound, they shifted the air around it. Memory, perhaps the most stubborn inheritance, remained. Maria, in her last years, would sit with young people under a tree and read Joaquim's words aloud, and when she closed the book, she would remind listeners that history is not a single ledger. Keep the names, she would say. Remember the many ways harm moves, and then decide what you will do when the choice comes to your hands. If this story has held your attention, and you value narratives that look unflinchingly at love, power, and consequence, consider liking and subscribing for more historical dramas that ask difficult questions and keep memory alive. Share your thoughts in the comments. Remembering is not a private act but a conversation we hold with the past and with each other.